They've always been destroying jobs. They've always been creating jobs. That's part of the nature of technology. The last set of jobs that may never be replaced are simply being human. What we'd like to do is have technology complement humans. That is to make humans more valuable. The next 5 or 10 years are going to be some of the most pivotal years in human history. The things that are robotic or machine made, they'll be so plentiful that they won't have the same value or meaning.
Hi, my name is Mike Belinsky. I'm Director of AI at Schmidt Sciences.
I'm Erik Brynjolfsson. I'm a professor at Stanford, where I run the Stanford Digital Economy Lab, part of the Institute for Human-Centered AI.
In your opinion, what do you think one job that AI will never automate?
Certainly, AI right now is not great at unstructured tasks, is not great at physical tasks, but I think those things will start happening more and more. Ultimately, the last set of jobs that may never be replaced are simply being human. And I think that we may, just as I have an artisanal rug from Guatemala that I think is really valuable, not in spite of the flaws, but because of the flaws it has that real humans put in it, I think that in the future we will value that kind of human connection, whether it's in relationships with our kids and friends, or whether it's in playing a game of poker or basketball with other real humans, or sharing a song or a story or a joke. I think those kinds of interpersonal interactions are ultimately going to value more and more. And the things that are robotic or machine made, they'll be so plentiful, they'll be so cheap that they won't really have the same kind of value or meaning as human connection.
What are features of jobs that make them harder to automate? What are features of jobs that make them easier to automate?
Well, it's a constantly changing set, and large language models have taken a bunch of things that used to be very hard and made them much easier. I was reading this book called A Brief History of AI, and it had this list, telling stories, describing what's in a picture, summarizing a document. That list was things that we were nowhere near solving. And I was like, wait a minute, what's wrong with this book? Because we've basically addressed all of those with current generative AI. And then I looked at the cover date, and it was, believe it or not, 2021. So that just highlights how rapidly things have changed in terms of what they can do. They can make short videos, and increasingly they have pretty good interpersonal skills too. There was a study that had a bunch of human doctors and AIs make some diagnoses, and then had the patients evaluate them. And it turned out that the AI was slightly better than the doctors on the accuracy of the diagnoses, but it actually did much better than the doctors on bedside manner.
So if you play that forward, many people now are saying, gosh, AI might take our jobs. What's your take?
Well, AI, other technologies have always been destroying jobs. They've always been creating jobs. That's part of the nature of technology. That said, I expect it to accelerate. AI will increase the churn. There may be some evidence that's already happening in certain categories like software engineering, call centers. I don't think it's going to happen as fast as some of my Silicon Valley technology friends believe, but I think it'll be faster than it did in some of the earlier eras.
Can we know now and can we predict now maybe where the balance will fall? Will it create more jobs? Will it destroy more jobs? Is there something about the jobs that it'll create or destroy that we can kind of understand today?
When technology makes a job more efficient, it has two effects. One is that you don't need as many people to produce the same amount of output. But the other effect is as the costs come down, people demand more output. And those two effects go in opposite directions. So interestingly, in some cases, that technological advance leads to fewer jobs, which is kind of intuitive. But in other cases, it actually leads to more jobs. Let me give you a concrete example of the second case, because that's the less intuitive one. When jet engines made pilots more efficient, did that mean that we didn't have as many pilots anymore? No, of course we had a lot more because people just flew a lot more.
I remember also reading something about ATMs and the effect there, how when they were created, they automated a large portion of a bank teller's job. But as a result, we actually have more branches.
That's right. They have just recently started turning down, but for about 20 years, they actually led to, or they were correlated at least, with more demand for bank tellers.
Can you tell us a little bit about your AI2050 project?
Sure.
And also, what are the projects you're thinking of next?
Sure. AI can be used, as I said earlier, to automate jobs and to replace people. It can also be used to augment and allow people to do new things and increase overall demand. So what I wanted to do for the AI2050 project was try to gently steer technology towards augmenting humans, towards allowing humans to do new things as opposed to having machines simply replace them. And it was motivated by a paper I wrote called The Turing Trap, in homage to Alan Turing. As our listeners probably know, Alan Turing, among other things, came up with the Turing test, the idea that the ultimate test of AI is how closely it could match human capabilities. In fact, if it could perfectly imitate humans, that was the goal. So you couldn't tell which was which. Sounds inspiring, but for an economist, is actually exactly the wrong thing to do. When a technology perfectly imitates humans, it is a substitute for humans, and that drives down wages. What we'd like to do is have technology complement humans. That is to make humans more valuable, so that will drive up wages instead. And one of the ways to do that is to come up with new benchmarks, new targets. Right now, most of the benchmarks out there, and there are dozens of them, if not hundreds, are basically implicitly or explicitly aimed at having machines match humans. Humans can recognize images. Can a machine recognize images just as well? And right now, we're coming up with a new set of benchmarks that humans and machines can work together and try to do as well as possible, rather than the machine all by itself hitting the benchmarks. So for instance, you could have, instead of a machine reading a medical image, you could have the machine and a radiologist work together to read the medical image. This will steer technologists towards creating machines that are able to communicate their ideas to the human. Human are able to interpret what's going on, and the two of them should do as well as possible rather than the machine by itself.
What's your intuition there? I mean, you could imagine a world where the human and AI team is a stepping stone to the AI just becoming very good at both accuracy and also explainability to the patient.
In fact, I think it's very likely it may be a stepping stone, but that period where the human and machine work together could be a long time. Self-driving cars have almost gone through all those different stages. Initially, machines didn't do anything. Then there's these 6 levels of self-driving, and right now we're somewhere in the middle. We're just getting to the point where the machines can drive by themselves. It took longer than I expected. I rode my first self-driving car in 2012, and I thought, full self-driving was right around the corner. But here it is, 2025, and you can drive around parts of San Francisco and other places, but it's still not pervasive. So that one took a little longer. And then I would say there are even other tasks where I suspect it'll take decades for us to progress through all those. There's probably no task that ultimately, in the fullness of time, machines won't be able to figure out how to do. But I think there's going to be a pretty long period where humans and machines can do better than machines by themselves. The other thing I want to highlight about this, by the way, that I only glossed over there, is that it's not just a matter of taking existing tasks and then seeing if machines can do them. The bigger upside is figuring out new things, new capabilities. In that paper, The Turing Trap, that I wrote, I did a little thought experiment. Daedalus was this mythological engineer who, among other things, supposedly made these humanoid robots that were indistinguishable, that could walk and talk just like humans. And I thought the thought experiment was, suppose he had taken those robots and looked around at all the tasks that the ancient Athenians were doing and said, let's match all of them. Let's have the robots make tunics. Let's have them make chariots. Yeah. If you're sick, the robots will burn incense for you, and so on. And eventually you'd have like rooms filled with clay pots and everything else that the ancient Greeks had. But you could see pretty quickly that simply mimicking what you were doing already is kind of a low ceiling. What you really want is to do new things. You want to have iPhones and supersonic jets and mRNA vaccines and all sorts of other amazing, wondrous things. Similarly, today, if all we did was automate what we're already doing, I think our descendants would be a little bit disappointed. And they say, wait a minute, don't we get any new stuff?
It seems like AI will be very valuable to society. When you look at the valuations of the frontier labs that are building this, they are very high. So there's a lot of, it seems, economic value being put on AI.
Or the expectation of it anyway.
Or the expectation of it. How do we measure? How do we see the value AI is creating in the data?
Yeah. So couple things. First off, if you look at specific implementations of AI, you often find some really eye-popping numbers. For instance, I did a project where we looked at the phased rollout of a contact center AI system that allowed LLMs to aid contact center workers in answering questions. And what we found was that very quickly, within just a few months, 4 or 5 months, the workers who had access to the LLM did significantly better, up to 30% better, 35% better for some of the newer, less skilled workers. So that was a really big number. Other people have done studies of software. Sometimes they get even triple-digit numbers, like doubling of productivity in management consulting, writing. There have been a number of studies now. That said, there's a bit of a paradox in that when you roll everything up to the economy as a whole, the U.S. economy is actually not having a productivity boom. So what's going on there? I think part of it is a measurement problem. AI can create lots of new digital goods and services that aren't measured. If you use Gemini for free, that doesn't add to GDP, at least not directly. Same with Wikipedia or YouTube or email or Gmail, all these things, because GDP measures things that are bought and sold in the economy, and with few exceptions, if something is free, it doesn't add to GDP. So that's a problem, because you're still getting value from those. So I have a new measure called GDP-B that our lab is working on, where we seek to explicitly measure those benefits and count how much you'd have to be paid to be willing to give up a product. Like, would I have to pay you $10 to stop using Wikipedia for a month? Would I have to pay you $50? Depending on what numbers you get, you start getting a picture of how valuable these goods and services are, even if they're free. So as I said, part of it is measurement. The other big part of it is that with most really important technologies, economists call them general purpose technologies, like the steam engine and electricity, it took literally decades before you got the full impact.
Oh, wow.
With electricity, it took about 30 or 40 years from when it was first introduced. The initial factories that introduced electricity had almost no productivity gains. 30 years later, they figured out how to restructure the factories, organizing them in new ways so you could get assembly lines and the flow of materials. That did lead to a doubling and even tripling of productivity in those factories. So what was going on there was the technology itself was important, but the real value came from catalyzing a set of business process changes, a set of reorganization, new products, new services, new skills. Similarly, I think that AI, it has some value in lots of different places, but the real value is going to come when we rethink our society and take advantage of the ability to do things and fundamentally new things, rather than simply swapping out one human for a piece of technology here and there.
So you're describing a world where, as AI comes in, it automates some work, it augments other work, it creates new types of skills, but then also at a much higher level, it changes how we work.
Exactly. Right. And that changing in how we work, that's subtle and complicated, and it's hard for any of us to imagine exactly what it would be in advance, but ultimately it's much more valuable. Let me give you another thought experiment. I love these little thought experiments. So suppose Jeff Bezos had walked into a bookstore in 1995 and said, "Oh, we should automate this bookstore. Look at that cashier. I'm going to build a robot cashier and put it where the human cashier is, and then we won't have any more labor." And so went ahead and built this new bookstore with robot cashiers instead of human cashiers. If we looked back and he did that, I don't think he'd be, Amazon wouldn't be worth trillions of dollars today. That's like nice, but it's not fundamentally changing the experience of buying books. Instead, there's a complete rethinking. And it took time for that kind of reorganization of retailing to play out. Here it is, 30 years later. And, there's lots of e-commerce, but traditional retailing actually is still the dominant way that people buy things. So these things take a while before they spread through the whole economy and change the economy. It becomes more and more productive as we do that reorganization, but A, it's hard to think of, and B, it takes a while to diffuse.
Is that kind of the journey of economic progress? Is first you kind of add a technology or a tool to an existing business process, and it has some benefit, but then you change the business process and it has a much more substantial benefit?
That's right. Over time, people, new people often start being more creative and saying, hey, we could do things differently than our parents did or than the guy before me did. And that kind of creativity ultimately unlocks a lot more value.
So, Erik, what advice would you give to someone who might be worried about getting displaced by AI?
Well, to be fair, I think we all should be worried. There's going to be changes, but we all should be hopeful as well. The right place to be is thinking what I call mindful optimism. There's some big challenges ahead, but if we work hard, we got this. And we are able to use these tools to change the world to be better. These tools are not going to decide for us what we do with them. And right now we have an amazing opportunity. I think the next 5 or 10 years are going to be some of the most pivotal years in human history. We all need to think hard about what kind of world we want to shape with these awesome tools that our friends in AI have given us.